Tonight, 4 developments are unfolding around the Strait of Hormuz, and each one would be serious, even if it were happening alone. A civilian container ship is burning after suffering major damage near one of the world's most important shipping corridors. Its crew has abandoned the vessel, and one mariner remains unaccounted for. In Muscat, Iranian diplomats have returned from negotiations without accepting an Omani proposal designed to restore safe passage through the strait. Along Iran's coastline, explosions have been reported near radar sites, missile facilities, drone infrastructure, and air defense positions, as American forces conduct another large round of strikes. And from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps comes a declaration that no vessel will be permitted to pass until American intervention in the region ends. None of these developments, considered separately, proves that a wider war is now unavoidable. But together, they reveal a crisis moving in 2 opposite directions at once. Diplomats are searching for a formula that would reopen the waterway without humiliating either side. Military commanders are behaving as though the opportunity for compromise may already have passed. The question is no longer simply whether the Strait of Hormuz is technically open. The real question is whether anyone involved still has enough authority to keep it open after an agreement is signed. Welcome back to Global Frontline Analysis. Here, we focus not only on what happened, but on the military, political, and economic calculations that explain why it happened. If you value calm analysis of fast-moving international crises, subscribe and tell us in the comments which country you are watching from, because the consequences of what is happening in Hormuz will not remain confined to Iran, Oman, or the United States. They could eventually reach fuel stations, factories, shipping companies, and households thousands of miles away. To understand why the events of July 11th matter, we need to begin with 3 people occupying 3 very different positions inside this crisis. The first is Pete Hegseth, the senior American official overseeing the Pentagon, who responded to the announcement of new U.S. strikes with 8 blunt words. Iran made a poor choice. Now they pay. The statement contained none of the careful language normally found in military briefings. There was no reference to proportionality, de-escalation, or the preservation of diplomatic space. It presented the American response as a direct consequence of an Iranian decision. A choice had been made. A price would now be imposed. The second person is Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, who had traveled to Muscat to discuss what he described publicly as arrangements for the safe movement of ships through the Strait of Hormuz. According to reporting on the negotiations, Oman presented a proposal that could have restored operations in both major shipping lanes, including the southern route through Omani waters. The arrangement appears to have been designed as a face-saving compromise. It would not necessarily have required Iran to confess wrongdoing, surrender its wider negotiating position, or make an immediate concession on the nuclear dispute. Yet the Iranian delegation reportedly could not obtain authorization from Tehran to approve it. Araghchi returned with the proposal, still under internal review. The third person has not been publicly identified. That person was a civilian crew member aboard the Cyprus-flagged container ship GFS Galaxy. The vessel was traveling through the southern route when it was attacked and suffered significant damage near the engine room. A fire broke out. The crew abandoned the ship and entered lifeboats. Most were reported rescued or accounted for, but one mariner remained missing as the crisis developed. These 3 individuals represent the 3 levels on which this confrontation is now operating. Hegseth represents military punishment. Araghchi represents diplomacy constrained by internal politics. The missing crew member represents the human cost carried by people who had no influence over either process. The sequence of events is important because the attack on the GFS Galaxy did not occur in a diplomatic vacuum. It happened as Iran and Oman were attempting to find a formula for navigation through the strait. Washington had already communicated a clear demand. Iran needed to state publicly that the shipping channels were open and that commercial vessels would not be attacked. American officials were not merely asking for a private assurance transmitted through mediators. They wanted a statement that shipping companies, governments, and insurance markets could evaluate. From Washington's perspective, a confidential promise would have little value if captains, port authorities, and underwriters still believed that vessels could be fired upon without warning. The demand for a public declaration was therefore about credibility as much as diplomacy. The United States wanted Iran to attach its reputation to the promise of safe passage. Tehran faced a more complicated calculation. A public statement that the strait was open could be portrayed by Iranian hardliners as recognition that American pressure had succeeded. It could also undermine the system of permissions, routes, and maritime charges that Iran had been attempting to impose. Even if civilian diplomats were prepared to accept a compromise, the Revolutionary Guard would need to enforce that compromise at sea. That distinction is central to the entire crisis. Iran's foreign ministry can negotiate language. The IRGC Navy controls weapons, patrol craft, surveillance systems, and the operational decisions that determine whether a merchant vessel reaches its destination. If those two institutions are not following the same chain of command, an agreement signed in a conference room may not survive its first encounter with a ship in the water. Oman's role is especially important because Muscat has often served as a communication bridge between governments that cannot speak openly or directly. Oman is not viewed by Iran in the same way as a formal American ally, hosting a large combat force. It maintains working relations across regional divisions and has repeatedly provided diplomatic space for sensitive negotiations. That made the reported proposal more valuable. Iran could have presented an Omani arrangement domestically as a regional maritime understanding rather than a surrender dictated by Washington. The proposal reportedly aimed to reopen the northern and southern routes and return navigation closer to the system that existed before the current war. It offered a practical answer to the immediate question of how ships could move. It did not resolve the nuclear dispute, the sanctions regime, the status of Iranian oil exports, or the wider American military presence in the Middle East. But it could have reduced the risk that a routine commercial voyage would trigger another round of strikes. Arachi's inability to approve the proposal therefore raises a deeper question. Was Tehran simply requesting more time to review a technically complicated arrangement? Or did the foreign minister lack the political authority to commit the IRGC to rules it did not support? The timing of the attack on the GFS Galaxy makes the second possibility difficult to dismiss. The vessel was not moving through a random corner of the Persian Gulf. It was reportedly using the southern route near Omani waters, the same general corridor promoted as an alternative for commercial traffic and discussed in the diplomatic process. Iranian accounts described the vessel as using an unauthorized route and presented the attack as an enforcement action or warning. But that explanation creates its own contradiction. If Iranian diplomats were negotiating the restoration of shipping through the southern route, while Iranian forces were prepared to strike vessels using it, then either the diplomatic team did not know the military's rules, the military did not accept the diplomatic team's mission, or both sides understood the contradiction and continued anyway. None of those explanations is reassuring. A failure of communication would suggest that decisions involving missiles, civilian vessels, and international waterways are being made without reliable coordination. Deliberate interference by the IRGC would suggest something more serious. A military institution willing to prevent civilian diplomats from reaching an agreement that could reduce its control over the strait. There is also a third possibility. Iranian leaders may have believed that escalating at sea would improve their leverage in Muscat. Under this interpretation, the attack was not designed to destroy diplomacy, but to strengthen Iran's position by demonstrating that no navigation arrangement could function without Tehran's approval. States often combine negotiations with pressure. They conduct exercises during talks, impose sanctions before meetings, or move forces to create urgency. But attacking a civilian ship is a far more dangerous form of leverage because the result cannot be fully controlled. A missile or drone does not communicate only with the opposing government. It can kill mariners, ignite cargo, block a shipping lane, trigger insurance exclusions, and force other militaries to respond. What may begin as a calibrated warning can rapidly become an event that neither side is politically capable of ignoring. After the GFS Galaxy was damaged, the IRGC declared the Strait of Hormuz closed until further notice, and connected its reopening to the end of American intervention in the region. The wording matters. Until further notice provides no timetable. Connecting navigation to the termination of American involvement establishes a condition that cannot realistically be satisfied in the near term. The United States maintains forces, bases, partnerships, and security commitments across the Middle East. Washington will not dismantle that position simply to meet an Iranian condition for commercial passage. By selecting a demand that the United States is almost certain to reject, the IRGC was effectively describing a closure without a practical exit mechanism. The declaration also attempted to transform a military capability into legal authority. Iran possesses geography, coastal weapons, patrol boats, mines, missiles, drones, and surveillance systems that can threaten the strait. Those capabilities allow it to interfere with navigation. They do not automatically grant Iran the internationally recognized right to suspend passage through the entire waterway. Under the widely accepted transit passage framework governing straits used for international navigation, coastal states may regulate matters such as safety and pollution, but they are not generally entitled to halt international transit for political leverage. Iran can physically challenge that principle. It cannot easily persuade the world's major trading states to accept it. This distinction between physical control and legal legitimacy has defined the Hormuz crisis from the beginning. Tehran argues that it cannot be excluded from the management of a waterway bordered partly by Iranian territory and directly connected to Iranian security. The United States and its partners argue that no coastal power may convert a global choke point into a tollgate or strategic hostage. Both positions contain different forms of power. Iran has proximity. The United States has a larger conventional military, extensive surveillance capabilities, regional bases, and alliances. The shipping industry stands between them, attempting to determine whose warnings are more credible. That is why declarations alone cannot reopen the strait. A government may announce that navigation is safe, but captains must still be willing to enter. Ship owners must still risk their vessels. Crews must still agree to sail. Insurers must still provide coverage. Ports must still accept schedules that depend on uninterrupted transit. The GFS Galaxy attack sends a message to every one of those actors. Even if some vessels continue moving, the danger is no longer theoretical. A ship following a route described as available can still be hit, disabled, and abandoned. The American response began within hours. CENTCOM stated that U.S. forces had struck approximately 140 Iranian military targets with precision weapons launched by aircraft, drones, and naval platforms. Reported target categories included coastal surveillance radars, missile and drone storage areas, launch positions, air defense systems, and other infrastructure connected to Iran's ability to threaten ships. Explosions were reported at multiple locations along or near Iran's southern coastline, including areas around Bandar Abbas, Keshem Island, Sirik, Chabahar, Bushehr, and Asaluye. The geographic distribution is significant. This was not described as a single retaliatory hit against one launcher believed to have attacked one vessel. It appears to have been an effort to weaken an entire network. Maritime attacks depend on more than the weapon that reaches the target. They require sensors to detect vessels, communications to distribute targeting data, storage sites to protect missiles and drones, launch crews to prepare them, command facilities to authorize action, and air defenses to protect the system from retaliation. By striking different parts of that chain, the United States was attempting to reduce Iran's capacity to repeat the attack. When combined with earlier rounds during the same period, CENTCOM's announcements placed the number of Iranian military targets hit above 300. The number is impressive, but numbers alone can be misleading. One destroyed radar may matter more than several empty storage structures. A damaged launcher may be replaced faster than a trained crew. A strike can destroy equipment without changing the decision that caused the equipment to be used. Military degradation and political coercion are related, but they are not identical. The United States can make each Iranian attack more expensive. It cannot guarantee that Iranian commanders will conclude that restraint is preferable. This is the central limitation of the American strategy. Washington is trying to achieve several objectives simultaneously. It wants to protect civilian shipping, preserve freedom of navigation, reassure regional partners, avoid a prolonged occupation, prevent oil prices from rising uncontrollably, and maintain enough diplomatic space for negotiations. Those goals can conflict. A limited strike may fail to deter Iran. A much larger campaign may produce stronger deterrence, but also provoke missile attacks on American bases and partner countries. Destroying Iranian coastal systems may improve short-term maritime security, but it can also convince Tehran that it must retaliate quickly before additional capabilities are lost. The United States therefore faces a familiar coercive dilemma. It must impose enough cost to make further attacks unattractive, without creating a situation in which Iranian leaders believe that escalation is their only remaining path. Hegseth's message removed much of the ambiguity surrounding the immediate American intention. Iran made a poor choice. Now they pay. The strength of the wording lies in its simplicity. It tells Iranian commanders that actions against commercial vessels will trigger consequences. But simplicity can also become a constraint. Once retaliation is publicly framed as automatic, Washington may find it more difficult to ignore smaller incidents, disputed encounters, or attacks conducted by forces whose command relationship is unclear. Every future confrontation becomes a test of credibility. If Iran attacks and the United States does not respond, the threat appears weaker. If the United States responds every time, it risks entering an escalation cycle controlled partly by Iranian tactical decisions. Iran faces a similar problem. The IRGC has portrayed control over Hormuz as a symbol of sovereignty and resistance. If commercial ships begin using routes Tehran has declared unauthorized without consequence, the Guard's authority appears weaker. If it fires on those ships, American strikes intensify. Each side has built a public position that makes compromise politically costly. Diplomacy is supposed to create language that allows both sides to step backward without admitting defeat. The Oman proposal may have represented exactly that kind of mechanism. The attack on the GFS Galaxy made the mechanism harder to use. The internal Iranian dimension may be even more consequential than the exchange of fire. The current leadership is operating under the pressure of war, succession, economic damage, and demands for retaliation. Iran's supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has reportedly vowed revenge for the killing of his father. The political effect of such a vow extends beyond any specific operation. It establishes an atmosphere in which restraint can be portrayed as weakness and compromise can be portrayed as betrayal. A foreign minister trying to accept a navigation agreement must consider not only whether the terms protect Iranian interests, but whether the decision can survive inside a political system where powerful institutions derive legitimacy from resistance. The IRGC is not simply another branch of the armed forces. It is a military, political, and economic institution with its own history, networks, and strategic worldview. It has long emphasized asymmetric methods designed to offset the conventional superiority of the United States. Small boats, coastal missiles, drones, mines, cyber operations, and partner forces can create risks at a fraction of the cost of matching the U.S. Navy ship for ship. The Strait of Hormuz is especially suited to that approach. It is narrow, crowded, and bordered by complex coastlines. Commercial traffic follows predictable lanes. A relatively small number of incidents can generate a much larger economic effect, because shipping companies price risk before physical closure becomes complete. Iran does not need to sink every vessel to disrupt trade. It needs to convince enough companies that passage may no longer be commercially rational. American forces can destroy launch sites, but the psychological component of maritime disruption is harder to eliminate. A missile does not need to hit its target to alter behavior. An intercepted drone can still raise premiums. A warning broadcast can cause a captain to delay entry. A burning ship can influence hundreds of voyages that never come within sight of it. This is why the condition of the strait cannot be measured only by counting vessels that successfully pass through. Analysts must also examine delays, diversions, charter rates, insurance costs, crew availability, and changes in the types of ships willing to make the journey. A waterway may be officially open while operating far below normal capacity. It may also be declared closed while some traffic continues under military escort or at elevated risk. On paper, those situations appear contradictory. In commercial reality, they can exist simultaneously. The economic consequences begin with energy, but they do not end there. A substantial share of globally traded oil and liquefied natural gas normally moves through or near the Strait of Hormuz. Major Asian economies, including China, India, Japan, and South Korea, depend heavily on Gulf energy. European markets are also affected through global price competition, even when individual cargoes are sourced elsewhere. If Hormuz becomes unreliable, buyers seek alternative supplies. That increases demand for oil from the United States, Russia, West Africa, and other producers. Tankers travel longer distances. Freight costs rise. Refineries compete for replacement grades that may not perfectly match their equipment. Governments release reserves or pressure producers to increase output. First movement in crude prices may appear manageable, but the effects can spread into diesel, aviation fuel, petrochemicals, fertilizer, plastics, and transportation. A sustained disruption would not hurt every country equally. Iran itself would face severe difficulty exporting energy. Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates would confront constraints depending on their access to pipelines and alternative terminals. Saudi Arabia possesses routes toward the Red Sea, but those systems cannot effortlessly replace every barrel normally shipped through Hormuz. Import-dependent economies would face higher costs. Energy exporters outside the Gulf could benefit financially. The result would be a redistribution of revenue produced not by new economic value, but by insecurity. War risk insurance is one of the earliest indicators. Underwriters do not need to believe that total closure is certain. They only need to conclude that the probability of damage has increased. Higher premiums can make voyages uneconomic even before governments issue formal prohibitions. Ship owners may also demand additional compensation for crews, while some mariners may refuse assignments altogether. A missing crew member from the GFS Galaxy makes those calculations painfully real. To governments, the vessel may be evidence in a dispute over maritime authority. To its crew, it was a workplace. The people aboard were not negotiating the Oman proposal. They did not decide where American forces should be stationed, or whether Iran should control shipping lanes. They were operating machinery, monitoring cargo, standing watches, and completing an ordinary commercial voyage through an extraordinary security environment. When the engine room was damaged and the crew entered lifeboats, the strategic debate became physical. A route, a policy, and a warning were transformed into fire, smoke, and a missing person. That human reality is also why the United States could not treat the incident as a symbolic disagreement. Washington has publicly framed its operations as protecting civilian mariners and commercial navigation. Failing to respond after a highly visible attack would have weakened that claim and encouraged doubts among both allies and adversaries. Yet responding creates additional risks for regional states. Iran has claimed retaliatory attacks on military facilities across several Gulf countries and in Jordan. Some of those claims remain difficult to verify independently, and the extent of damage is unclear. Even unverified claims can influence regional calculations because governments must prepare for the possibility that future strikes will be real. Bahrain hosts important American naval facilities. Qatar and the United Arab Emirates contain major bases and logistics hubs. Kuwait supports U.S. operations. Oman has attempted to remain a mediator. Jordan has carefully balanced security cooperation with the desire to avoid direct involvement. Iranian attacks on or near these territories would place their governments under pressure to respond, strengthen air defenses, or provide greater support for American operations. That would be strategically counterproductive for Tehran if its goal is to isolate Washington. Iran has historically benefited when regional governments fear being trapped between the United States and the Islamic Republic. Directly threatening those governments can push them closer to the American security system they may otherwise wish to keep at a distance. Jordan illustrates the danger. It does not want to become a battlefield in a U.S.-Iranian confrontation. But if Iranian weapons repeatedly target installations on Jordanian territory, Oman may conclude that neutrality no longer provides protection. The same logic applies to Oman. Muscat's value as a mediator depends on its ability to maintain communication with all sides. If military operations threaten Omani territory or shipping routes while diplomats are meeting in the capital, the space for mediation narrows. That may be one reason the next phase of diplomacy will be harder than the previous one. Negotiators will not only need to agree on language, they will need to prove that the institutions carrying weapons will obey it. The most optimistic scenario is that the scale of the American strikes, combined with economic pressure and regional concern, forces Tehran to reconsider the cost of maritime enforcement. Under this scenario, Iran could accept a revised Omani arrangement, publicly state that international navigation will be respected, and preserve some symbolic role in monitoring nearby waters without attacking commercial traffic. The United States could then pause strikes while claiming that deterrence had succeeded. For this outcome to become credible, shipping would need to resume without new incidents. The IRGC would need to communicate clear rules to its coastal units, and American officials would need to avoid adding conditions unrelated to immediate maritime safety. A second possibility is a period of controlled but recurring violence. Iran might avoid declaring a permanent opening while allowing selected vessels to pass. The United States might continue striking launchers and radars after each attack without expanding to leadership or civilian infrastructure. Diplomacy would continue in parallel, producing temporary arrangements that repeatedly fail. This could last longer than either side expects. Limited wars often develop routines. One side attacks, the other retaliates. Both claim success. Neither resolves the political dispute. The danger is that routines create complacency until an incident causes far more casualties than intended. A missile could hit a crowded ship. A strike could kill senior commanders. An Iranian weapon could cause significant casualties at an American base. At that point, the political space for limited retaliation could disappear. A third scenario is a broader regional escalation. Iran could intensify missile and drone operations against bases and partner states. Armed groups aligned with Tehran could open additional fronts. The United States could expand its target list from coastal systems to command centers, strategic industries, or leadership facilities. Israel could become more directly involved. Gulf states could provide greater operational support. Under this scenario, the Strait of Hormuz would become only one part of a conflict stretching across airspace, ports, pipelines, and regional capitals. This outcome is not inevitable, but the conditions that could produce it are visible. Failed diplomacy, public ultimatums, attacks on civilian shipping, and military positions that leave little room for retreat. A fourth possibility is an internal Iranian political reckoning. Continued strikes may deepen disagreement between civilian diplomats who want an economic exit and military leaders who view compromise as surrender. That disagreement could result in a clearer chain of command, allowing negotiations to produce enforceable decisions. It could also produce the opposite effect, with hardliners consolidating control and excluding diplomats from meaningful authority. Outside observers have limited visibility into these debates. The absence of an immediate foreign ministry endorsement of every IRGC statement may suggest differences, but silence alone is not proof of a fracture. Iranian institutions sometimes distribute roles deliberately, allowing diplomats to sound flexible while military leaders apply pressure. What appears to be internal conflict may also be coordinated bargaining. Responsible analysis must keep both possibilities open. The next indicators will therefore matter more than the rhetoric alone. Analysts will watch whether Arachi returns to Muscat with authority to accept a concrete arrangement. They will examine whether Iranian state media and the foreign ministry repeat the IRGC's claim that the strait is closed. They will monitor new CENTCOM statements for changes in target categories. Strikes focused on radars and launch sites would suggest that Washington remains concentrated on maritime protection. Attacks on broader command, political, or economic targets would indicate an expanding objective. Shipping data will reveal whether vessels continue using the southern route and whether traffic volume is recovering or declining. Insurance markets will show whether commercial actors believe official assurances. Regional air defense activations will indicate whether Iranian retaliation is continuing. The public activity of Iran's senior leadership will also be closely examined. Visible coordination between the Supreme Leader's office, the government, and the IRGC would suggest that Tehran is presenting a unified strategy. Contradictory messages could point toward internal disagreement, deliberate ambiguity, or both. As of the morning of July 12th, the available facts do not provide a clean answer. The GFS Galaxy has been damaged, its crew forced into lifeboats, and one person reported missing. The IRGC has declared the waterway closed under conditions the United States will not accept. American forces have struck approximately 140 targets in the latest round, and more than 300 across several rounds. Iranian diplomats have returned from Oman with a proposal they were unable to approve immediately. Regional states are preparing for retaliation they did not seek. Oil and shipping markets are reassessing risk. These facts do not prove that diplomacy is dead. They do show that diplomacy is operating behind military events rather than controlling them. That is the most dangerous feature of the crisis. Arachi can negotiate a shipping formula, but the formula is meaningless unless armed units follow it. Hegseth can promise punishment, but punishment is temporary unless it changes the decisions made in Tehran. Oman can offer a face-saving exit, but no mediator can supply political authority that the negotiating parties do not possess. The GFS Galaxy can be rescued, repaired, or removed, but the image of its crew abandoning ship will remain in the calculations of every captain ordered toward Hormuz. The crisis is therefore not only a dispute over who controls a narrow waterway. It is a test of whether military power can be translated into a stable political arrangement, before another civilian vessel becomes the next message exchanged between governments. The immediate question is whether Iran will issue the public assurance Washington is demanding, and whether the IRGC will obey it at sea. The larger question is whether the officials speaking for Iran in Muscat are also the officials capable of controlling what happens in the strait. Until that question is answered, every negotiation will contain a hidden weakness. Every vessel will be a potential test. Every radar contact could become a warning. And every warning could begin another round of strikes. The ceasefire may still survive in diplomatic documents and official statements, But on the water, beside a damaged container ship and an empty place in its crew manifest, the conditions for the next confrontation may already be forming.